Hi everyone, this is Tim at North and South Podcasts. Hope you're all well. And this podcast is a history and politics podcast, and we haven't had one of those for a while. And I am going to be speaking to local Liverpool legend Ritchie Hunter, who is a radical historian, a radical politician, and a radical leveller. And he's currently digging up the earth for the common people on his allotment in South Liverpool. Ritchie, how are you? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Tim. That was a good introduction. I don't know whether I warrant all of that sort of praise. Yeah, I suppose the most thing I've been involved in the last 20 years is Nerve magazine. And that's probably what I'll be best known for is the sort of editing most of those magazines. And since we ran out of money, because we were all volunteers on it, it's just been a website. So, but the struggle goes on anyway. Go on.
Excellent stuff. But I've known you for about, I think, 17 years. I mean, you have been involved in a few campaigns locally, and I think I wrote a couple, maybe it was one, maybe it was two or three articles for the Nerve magazine back in the day about academisation in education and the impact of austerity, etc. But basically, whenever I go into Liverpool, you're always about fighting a good fight. And the Nerve magazine, I remember the police taking a few copies to see if there was any subversive material in, but I think they'll find far more dangerous stuff in the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Express, and even the Telegraph these days than was ever in the Nerve magazine, which just discussed radical history, radical politics. And by radical politics, let's be honest, a lot of the stuff in Nerve is mainstream social democratic stuff from all over the world and all over Europe. And unfortunately, the Anglo-Saxon model we seem to be going down in this country, I think it leaves a lot to be desired. So, Ritchie, well done for all your contributions to the local Liverpool political and historical scene. And I know that you've given a lot of time and effort into things. Now, we're going to have a chat today about a podcast that you've been involved in the production of in recent years. And although Nerve's online now, you told me about this. I'm still on your email list. And you told me about a guy called Harry Constable, and you were involved in a podcast about Harry Constable, which lasted for about 10 weeks. So who was Harry Constable and how did you get involved in that project?
Harry Constable was, I'll give a background on him first, I suppose. He was a docker. He was born in the First World War, and he came up through all of the poverty of the 20s, and he was from Wapping in London, in East London. So he came up through all that. So he'd known all of the sort of Jarrow strikers, the stuff about the Spanish Civil War and the fighting the fascists in Cable Street and all of that. That experience lended him to go on the docks down there because his family were a family of dockers. And he became an unofficial leader of the dockers after the Second World War. Now, the bit of background on that is that at that time, it wasn't the same unions as we have, even although some of the names are the same. The unions were they were in hand in glove, really, with the bosses and the government. And they had been through the Second World War. And they were imposing conditions down onto the docks when everybody was trying to change the whole of society just after the Second World War. Harry Constable led a few unofficial strikes because that's the only way that they could get the conditions. They couldn't wait for the officials to do it because by that time, he always said, well, the ship would have sailed, right? So, which is, actually, in fact, that's what would have happened if they'd have waited for the officials. Then the ship had gone, and it was too late to actually get what they wanted. And he came up against the Transport and General Workers Union in that the officials and the Transport and Workers, which is now part of Unite. So he was actually expelled by them because of his militancy. And they wouldn't allow him. At that time, you needed a card, a union card, to actually get a job on the docks. So they wouldn't allow him to work in his trade because he didn't have a union card. But the dockers who were on the quayside, they insisted that he worked. So he had to work with them for 4 years without a union card, and they protected him. At the end of that time, there was another strike, and they actually said, well, yeah, okay, we'll allow you to have a card. By that time, he joined what was called the Blue Union, which was another union that was on the docks at the time, which was the stevedores. So I'm telling you that part of it because later on there was a big strike, and this is where the connections with Liverpool comes. I mean, there was always connections before with Liverpool because of the docks, but in 1955, what happened on the docks in Liverpool was that they were fed up. The Transport and General Workers members were fed up that they were having to wait all the time for their officials, and so they all decided, 10,000 of them decided on Merseyside to join the stevedores union. And there was a bitter dispute because even tore apart families who were still loyal to the Transport General, which was called the White Union because of the colour of the card, and the stevedores was called the Blue Union because of the colour of their card. So so 10,000 actually went over into the Blue Union. There was a strike, a long strike, and then the TUC, the Trades Union Council, who were the arbiters of disputes between unions, said that they had to get back into the Transport and General Workers Union, and they had to, they were chucked out. The actual stevedore said, well, we have to abide by that. So these 10,000 dockers were left high and dry, and they had to go back into the transport. And I mean, the good part of that is that things had to change after that, and we got a much more democratic unions. But it's an interesting story, and people who are older, maybe who listen to your podcast, may have some memories of their dad being in this dispute, because it was right up and down all the docks on Liverpool. So Harry Constable was an official by that time of the stevedores, and he was helping the stevedores try to gain recognition, which failed actually. So that's, I mean, I've thought that was a potted history, and the podcasts that we made, which are on Nerve magazine, if you go to the website, say an awful lot more about his background, about his history, about conditions in London and the army and all of that sort of. It's a real social history podcast. There's also a book that it's taken from, which was his own words, Harry Constable's own words.
Yeah, and it's a brilliant podcast, because if you go onto the Nerve website, you can find the episodes that I listened to. I think it was over 10 weeks you released them, and I really enjoyed listening to them. And we'll put the details of the Nerve website in the podcast notes, and people can listen to it. But there was quite a coup involved, because you got some really, really good people involved in that. But I'll come to that in a moment, because you just give a fantastic summary there of what Harry Constable was all about. And just, I did a podcast with my dad. My very first one was with my dad, and we talked about the stevedores, the ones who used the hook to help load and unload the ships, and it was quite a skilled job. You've also mentioned there about Harry growing up and being impacted by the Jarrow March, was people from the northeast marching to London because of the poverty in the northeast. You've talked about the fight against Mosley's fascists in London. You also mentioned about the Spanish Civil War, when a lot of people, because of the intense poverty here and because of their ideals, went to fight in Spain. And not only did they go and fight, but many of them died. And there's a very powerful plaque, I think it's in the Unite Union buildings in Liverpool, of all the men from Liverpool who died. And one of them was at Jamara, one of the key battles where a lot of them died fighting for their beliefs. Harry Constable very much came from this tradition of, this intense kind of belief in his ideals and putting them into practice. What I thought was really good about the podcast, as well as in the early episodes, you talk about the power of the church. You talk about the housing situation and the poverty that people were in, who were working their socks off, working class people who were working very, very hard, and the poverty that they lived in. And I remember an uncle of mine saying that, my mum came from a family of 11 children, and, you know, they didn't have it easy, 11 mouths to feed. And often the priest would come to the house, this is my uncle telling me this, laughing about it, and take money off me nan, who had 11 kids, to go to the church, when really it should have been the other way around. And another thing that struck me was I think it was Harry's mum, such a strong character, where, you know, these people believed so much in the idea of doing the right thing and solidarity and working with others. Even when they were living in very, very, very tough circumstances themselves, they had these ideals and these beliefs that things could be better for people. And they made a lot of sacrifices for it. But I thought it was particularly strong, because I thought you'd go straight into Harry Constable's life, but understanding the socio-economic and political context that he grew up in, I thought that was very, very powerful in the first instance, and told us exactly where Harry came from and why he was so radical. Now, you managed to get some quite notable names involved in the podcast. Do you want to tell us how that happened?
Okay, so we got Christopher Eccleston, who does the main character of Harry, telling his tale. We got him through, and know an actor who's done the circuit, and Chris was, I mean, I don't know whether you've seen him in Our Friends in the North.
Yeah.
But he's just, I mean, he wanted that role because of the way that it was portrayed, you know, that the actual things he did. He didn't want the other role. He sort of rejected the other role, which was more accommodating within that. He wanted something that was, and he's quite a powerful character in that. Yeah. So he was good to get, and he's very busy, but we were able to, me and the actor John Davis, who knows him, we got him actually through Maxine Peake, and she said, "Oh, you do that." I mean, the thing for me is that Harry Constable was from the East End, right? So he did. I mean, I did speak to Harry Constable before he died in 2000, but he had an East End accent, and Chris is from Manchester. So that was one thing, but we didn't have time to sort of go to develop that. And anyway, it doesn't really matter that much. It's just that you know, the same things happened in Manchester and in Liverpool that happened in London to him. You know, the same sort of things. And he would be the first one to say that he wasn't a character; he was a leader on the docks and stuff. But he was self-effacing as well. He wouldn't say, you know, that leaders are people that, you know, once they become leaders, then they're celebrities. It's not that at all. So he'd understand us doing that, having that accent. So yeah, that's we got for the main one, and then we got Ethne Brown, and she obviously is from Brookside. She's well known in Liverpool. Does an awful lot of stuff, you know, in the way of work, social work, socially. You call it social work, I suppose, in the community. You know, doing stuff for the community, promoting stuff. We had Ethne Brown for our Joe Hill. In 2015, we did the play Joe Hill. I was in the Socialist Singers then, and I helped to organise and coordinate the showing of that at the Adelphi. And Ethne Brown was the compere. So I knew her from that sort of thing, and so she stood in, because we were sort of we'd had it at the point where we were trying to get Maxine Peake to do the other part, and you know, Maxine's just so busy, so Ethel just said, "Well, I'll do it."
Sorry, I thought both of those voices were brilliant. The way one was kind of providing the context, and then Christopher Eccleston was telling the story, and I thought that was brilliant, the way it was produced. But obviously you've got lots of primary information, and it was very rich, the script. There was so much description, so much understanding of all the different things. And were you involved in putting the script together?
Yeah, the original book, I mean, it was my dad actually who said to Harry Constable, because he knew him, well, why not, you know, record all of your escapades, if you like. And so that took place, and my dad had all of those, and he started off laying them down, typing them out and whatever. And But when my dad died, I took over doing the book, so I had to finish the book off. So I laid the book out. I got the book published along with my wife. She did the editing, the proofreading, and we published the book through Nerve. And then to get this publicity, that's what the podcast was about. So we decided that we couldn't do the whole book, and actually we couldn't use Harry's voice because they were on old tapes. That's why we had to get somebody else, an actor, to do it. And I wrote a synopsis of all the different stages of his life. And I even added in some other stuff that I'd found later on about, but one of the dockers was called Bill Johnson, and he was from Birkenhead. And he tells this story about after they'd been arrested for conspiracy or something in the 50s, that they were released because they couldn't find any evidence for it. And he was approached by Special Branch. You know, it tells the story of how he just came up to him and he said, look, you know, if it had been up to us, you would have been in prison now, you know. And it actually shows how much that those secret services are involved in stuff, you know, and how much that they've been. There was police giving evidence in the court that they'd been at every meeting of dockers since the 30s, and this was in the 50s. And you know how they fell down is because they used to take notes and then go back and compare the notes and then write there what they were going to say in court, and that obviously can't do that, and that's the reason why they couldn't convict the dockers. It's crazy. I mean, you have the same sort of thing happened later on with other dockers, where there was such a reaction to dockers being arrested that the whole country nearly stopped, and they had to call in someone called the official solicitor to say, whoever that is, you know, never been seen before, never been seen since. But the establishment trolled this fella in, you know, and said, oh, this fella is saying it's okay to let them go. But obviously it was because of the reaction of the amount of strikes, and they were really afraid that there would be a general strike about it. This was a bit later than Harry, but it's the same sort of thing.
You know what? It's interesting because I know a lot of people were put in prison even under Thatcher over a Camillate, etc., for trade union activity. And there is a recent there's been a lot recently about, you know, police officers undercover and some of the behaviour of the established authorities going into what might be deemed left-wing or, you know, anti-establishment organisations. And these are basically just people who are standing up for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the right to refuse to work based on their working conditions. And the way that these people have been treated as like enemies of the state right through the Cold War and beyond was absolutely shocking. But there has been a little bit of coverage of that recently in terms of the behaviour of undercover police, etc. But it's still an ongoing problem, particularly with the reluctance to acknowledge right-wing extremism now. And I know certainly across the pond, you still get a lot of organisations. The FBI now are a little bit more forward about the main issue with extremism in the United States is right-wing militant extremism. Yeah, the establishment's quite reluctant to acknowledge that and always tries to blame like the outsiders from abroad. But it's the same with these kind of things, isn't it? The way trade unionists are approached. And I say that as someone who did casework for the National Education Union. And we'll come on to a little in a minute about the lessons for today from Harry Constable's story. But it's a very, very important story because Harry didn't always stick with what the official unions said. He often said, no, that's not good enough. And he had a lot of support. And there was a bit of a saying in the docs that if Harry didn't get a job, I don't go. And it's one of the songs from the podcast, isn't it? If Harry don't go, then I don't go. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that saying?
Yeah, I think the song actually predated the book. It was done by Alan Parry because he knew the story, and the story goes something like it goes back to when he worked on the docks without a union card, and how they defended him, the other dockers who were, you know, you're talking about here that they were still getting picked out, in pen. Still got to go in a pen and get picked out. You can have a job. You can't have a job. I'll see you down the pub later. If you give us a fiver, you can have a job. That sort of stuff, right? And that actually went on. A lot of this stuff, recruitment for the docks, went on in the pub. So if you was in with the foreman or the one who was taking people on, then you got the job. So they always pushed people out who were militant, were saying that's not on. Let's defend it, or the health and safety is bad. Let's do something. They always push these people out. So it was a big thing for these other dockers where Harry worked to say, no, if Harry don't go, we don't go. And Alan Parry encapsulates that in his song called Harry Don't Go. And he says about it. It's a really good song and very catchy, So if you look Alan Parry up, ALUN Parry, then you're in for a treat for that one.
Yeah, and it's on the podcast as well. It's the opening song of each of the podcast episodes, and I think the out song as well. So well worth it. And by the second episode, you're singing along at the top of your voice. So that was brilliant too. There's a lot here. I mean, I could talk about this till I'm blue in the face. My granddad was a docker. It was spoke about with my dad on the first episode of this podcast, and he died in 1982. My granddad. But my dad always said when he was growing up that although the work was often patchy and they were very poor, my granddad never spoke ill about people from abroad. And he said there's a big thing now, isn't it, with the populist kind of movements, particularly like the idea of the Red Wall is blame the different groups, the vulnerable groups. And one of the great things about stories like Constables is the idea of, no, we don't just blame people who are different. We stand together and we unify. And I think that's a very important message, which we can come to in a minute. But one of the other big things about Constable, my granddad on my mum's side spoke about this. He died in 2005, was after the war, there was a bit of a saying that we don't want to go back to the 30s. And my granddad said he fought in the war for 5 years, came back. My granddad threw his medals away. He said there was nothing honourable or about the way I was treated or what we did. We did what we did. And he never spoke in a glorifying way about the war. And he was one of the first people to tell me about how it was the Soviets on the Eastern Front where the war. And this was quite an important thing back in the day to hear these kinds of things. But my granddad said he went to work building houses on Southport Road in Bootle, just as you go up towards Kirkdale into Liverpool. And he said that at lunchtime, people would go around and look at your work and go, you're not working this afternoon, and send you home. And he said, we just fought for 5 years in Europe and we're coming back and we're being treated like this in the United Kingdom. And there was very much a belief that after the war, with the election of the Labour government, that things really did need to change. Is that something that is important in the Harry Constable story?
Well, yeah. In 1945, one of the big things in there was that the government that was elected, Churchill was thrown out in 1945 and the Labour government was elected. And this is a real piece of history here. And then a couple of days after they were elected, and the dockers were on strike at that point, the troops were sent in to the docks. Mm. Yeah, so this was a Labour government. Labour government sending troops into the docks, and they were the dockers. Some of these dockers, there's a story there about one docker. He was 80 years old. 80. I mean, you can imagine. Like, and we're talking about putting the retirement age up now to what? 68, 69, 70. It's going to go on. But this is what was something that was expected, that people would work until they dropped. And this is just lucky that this probably got to the age of 80, I suppose. And so people had come back from the war. The soldiers had come back from the war, and they were just had enough, right? They'd had the 30s, they'd had the 20s, when it all started, when the crash and all that started before that. They'd gone through all this poverty and all this awful stuff. And then they'd gone to war and there'd been millions killed, and they'd come back and they were reluctant to give up their arms unless they got something. And that's what drove on the changes that we got, the National Health Service, all this, the social program, the house building, everything that went on there in 1945, which is what we need again, right? But we don't want to have to go to war to do it, to get it again, do we? We don't have to want to go back to where we were in 1930s or 1940s, so that we have to sort of take up arms. We don't want to do that. It should be done by right. People deserve that. And Harry Constable was one of those who was leading that struggle. You know, I mean, and he's one of many. He one of many that at that time were, you know, determined to change the society. Unfortunately, you know, that's for a certain amount of time. Yeah, we had a good standard of living, and it got better. I mean, I despair now that maybe we have to go back to that sort of thing to be able to change things back again, get the National Health Service back again, get house building back again, get nationalisation back again. You know, don't get me started.
Yeah, I think that people talk about it, you know, after the war, you had kind of the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. There was huge steps forward in terms of social provision, which allowed people to then use that as a springboard to move on to other things. And very much since the oil crisis of the 70s, there was kind of a stagnation of that. And don't forget, this is in a country that ran 1/4 of the world, you know what I mean? And you've still got these huge issues. But I think since 2007, we've seen the impact of austerity in this country. We've had the negative impacts of Brexit. We've had COVID and the pandemic. And again, we've almost become like a populist nation the last few years under Boris, etc. But we're now facing a cost of living crisis. We're now facing huge issues with the NHS and all the funding. And it's very much like we're at that point again where what is the social contract? What are the benefits of being a British citizen? People are working very hard and can't seem to get past first base. And it's a big issue, which I think is as relevant today as maybe it was just after the war. But as you say, these things go on, don't they?
Yeah, I think I'd probably go back a bit further than that, because it was in the 70s that they decided, you know, the powers that be that run the world, the big capitalists decided that they couldn't sustain this sort of level of the social back for people of giving you a good wage and good living and whatever, that they couldn't sustain that if they wanted to maintain their profits and their standard of living. So it's socialism for the rich, really, they wanted. And that was the 70s. And it was under a Labour government that they went to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And from that point on, really, they started looking at the hospitals, for instance, started closing hospitals and stuff. And then Thatcher came in. And so that was the biggie, wasn't it? Thatcher.
Yeah.
And she's been ever since. She's still around, isn't she? You know.
Yeah. I think it's interesting as well. You had that kind of like Ayn Rand belief in the individual coming out of the American dream kind of philosophy, and that Chicago school economics of like Hayek and Friedman underpinned the Reagan project in the United States and the Thatcher project on the back of the 70s, the oil crises, etc. And then ever since then, we've kind of had that issue of, you know, what's our vision for society? Is it to retreat into individualism? Obviously, you don't want state communism, but there's a lot in between there for debate. You know what I mean? Like we saw recently with Truss, she tried to impose that kind of Hayek and Friedian approach again and failed drastically.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on some of the other things you said about. I mean, Harry Constable came from a Catholic family. You know, they came from Ireland. They were very hot on the Irish freedom struggle, and that, you know, that is a big part of this, and it's tragic the way that this sort of divide and rule is being used to say we're not allowing people to come in who are suffering from some of the effects that we've done when we've but been bombing in Iraq, or we've been giving arms to Syria. You know, and we've been selling arms to them, and people are fleeing that, and it's part of the podcast says where there's a mosque. I think it's a mosque now in London near where he lived, and it started off by the Huguenots, and they'd come over. They'd fled repression from Holland and the Low Countries, Belgium, where Belgium is now.
They were Protestants fleeing persecution, weren't they?
Right. So they'd set up this place in London. When they went, and there was Jewish people there who were fleeing programs all over the world, and now it's Muslim. So there you've got all those generations of people fleeing, and it's like in there, you know, and it's they've been welcomed. There's always been something. Well, I've got this, and I don't want to give it. There's always been a bit of that, but on the whole, people welcome other people in, and it's tragic to see that's not. They're using this. I mean, the Mail uses it. The Mail that supported the fascists in the 30s do that all the time. Don't they? They try and split you up. So it's being used by the government to, and these are people. At the end of the day, these are people just like all of us.
Yeah, I think that the Daily Mail quite ran right-wing paper in the UK, and I think the Conservative government's very unpopular at the moment, and they seem to be playing this kind of anti-immigration, anti-minority groups agenda to try and maybe get some traction in the local elections. But as you say, mate, we've seen it all before, and it's a sad indictment of the situation when that's as low as they're willing to go. What do you think of the lessons of Harry Constable for today? Because
the basic lesson of Harry Constable is that it's about organizing yourselves, right? I'm involved in lots of different community. We're involved in the Don't Pay protest at the moment.
That's to do with utility bills, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a basic sort of community-led fight back, and that's what NERV was all about. It's all about the communities. They're using art as a weapon as well. Using that, so you add your prop, using pictures and images and stuff, and using that as a basic for community music, using that as for the community to build their resistance to what's going on. Ultimately what we've got to do is we have to build another society amongst ourselves. That's why I like rock music, because it gets you back to that sort of thing. But nobody's going to come on a white charger and release us, and it is going to get worse. The cost of living is going sky high, especially for food. And we need to pull together ourselves. We need to look at different alternatives for ourselves. There's a climate change is happening. Cars are not the answer. Electric cars are not the answer. We need to sort of think about, I'm not saying we go back to cavemen or anything like that, but people together making their own sort of entertainment, their own music, their own stuff that's going on. That's the best you can do. Any always better engaging with people, talking to people, and that's where the satisfaction comes, isn't it?
Yeah, I think one of the big issues with politics on the left, or even just liberal politics, whatever you want to call it, is this idea that people believe that, like, oh, that party will sort everything out, or this organisation will sort everything out, etc., etc., etc. And to an extent, you do need to be in groups to give yourself more power as a collective kind of position. But you need to come from the bottom up as well with those community groups in terms of organisation, because ultimately no one's going to do it for you. And that's where democratic legitimacy comes in as well, because we know what happens when you have an organisation that's top down. People lose that kind of inclusivity, etc. We know what we do when everyone's fractured as an individual. It's very hard to make meaningful change, but I know that that's a big part of your philosophy, the idea of people with similar interests coming together and making change happen themselves. And the Harry Constable idea was, I might disagree with my union and I might disagree with the Labour Party, therefore I'm going to do my own little thing as well. But I think the other message from all this is the fracture on the left, which sometimes can cause us problems when the right sometimes galvanise behind a figure. And there's lots of infighting on the right as well. And it's important that we don't, squabble over petty differences, but that we don't just agree that one organisation, one party is the be all and end all. We need to have a pluralistic society where people are standing up and trying to improve their lives as well. I think that's a very important message that comes from Constable and goes right through today as well.
He obviously was a trade unionist. I'm a trade unionist. I believe in trade unions. I believe that with the trade unions that your health and safety is locked down. You need to join a trade union. But what I don't like is the undemocratic nature of some of the trade unions. There was a funny, a nice story. I think it's in the podcast. And there was another mate of Harry Constable's who was an official. And he, when they had their strike, the Blue Union strike, he insisted that all the officials took the same pay as everybody on strike. So the others got strike pay. All the officials would take that same money, and so that puts it in perspective. Is that you do have leaders, and there's going to be leaders, and that's right that there should be people who push themselves forward and say, I'm going to do this, right? But let's not put them on a pedestal.
Let's not idolize them. Let's not idolize them.
They are human beings. They have faults like anybody else. So it needs the organization needs to be aware of that. So the organization needs to be doing stuff and controlling what's going on. That's the message from Harry Constable, is that he was a trade unionist and he didn't want to leave the transport. In fact, he tried to get back into it for 4 years because that was the union that represented the people he was amongst. But they would allow that because they had this structure. So we need to change those structures as well.
Absolutely, and I mean, I'm in the NEU, the National Education Union. I've done casework for them, and it can be frustrating being in a union. But I always had a quote: the only thing worse than being in a union is not being in a union. There are always internal power wranglings and all that, and things you disagree with. But together, the NEU has done more than any other union to change things. Yeah. I'm speaking to an independent councillor, or someone standing as an independent councillor, in a few weeks, and I've spoken to someone who left the Labour Party. I've spoken to another independent councillor. I'm still a paid up member of the Labour Party, but there's a lot of criticisms I've got of them. And it's important that we have these differences of opinion, but we can still galvanise behind general ideas and trends. And it is a difficult one because, the classic line from Life of Brian, I'm in the Judean People's Front and all this division. And I think it was Ken Loach who said the division on the left, doesn't always help us. And we do need to unite behind division. But as Harry Constable said, don't wait for things to change or for others to do it. Make it happen yourself as well. And I think that ultimately puts power with you, doesn't it, to try and change things? And amen to that.
The history is written by those winners, and winners up to now have been the class that we don't belong to, and so they've written this history, and it's not the same history as what we've lived, because we mostly be coming from working class or before that from lower classes, if you like, to use a horrible term. Then they haven't had the say. It's the people, the rich people who've had the say, who've written the history. So there's an awful lot of history which has gone our way. There's an awful lot of it. We just haven't been able to go that final step and overturn them lot at the top. But there is an awful lot of history that's worth looking at.
Absolutely. And I mean, as a history teacher, some of the stuff which I've taught, I've thought, who wrote this stuff? And it can be frustrating sometimes, particularly with the curriculum changes 10 years ago. A lot of good stuff was taken out to do with like social history in the UK, etc. But that's another story. You've also done another podcast about Edward Rushton, who's quite an important figure. Maybe we can come back and chat about Edward Rushton again. But just very briefly, do you want to say what Edward Rushton did, just in a few sentences? Because it's quite an interesting story, isn't it?
Okay, yeah. So Edward Rushton was born in about 1756, something like that.
Absolutely spot on, he was.
Is that right?
So, absolutely, yeah.
and he grew up. He was from Liverpool, and he grew up. Went to sea. He stopped the ship from sinking in the Mersey Bar. So his background was with the sea, and he then went on a slave ship, and he didn't like what was happening with the slaves. They'd all contracted this horrible disease which made them go blind. And the crew, and what usually happened at that time, the crew wouldn't go down there, but the captain would have chucked them all overboard. Yeah,
and then claim the insurance.
Claim the insurance on them. But he said, no, they're human beings. Well, I'm going to go down. And he went down, and he got them food and whatever. And so when he came back to Liverpool, he contracted this disease, which made him go blind. So he's known as Edward Ruston, the blind poet of Liverpool. And from that point, he defended the underdog. He defended the Polish resistance, the Irish freedom fighters, the American Revolution, the revolutionaries there, the French revolutionaries. And he wrote poems about all of these things. He's an amazing character, amazing. And there's been plays. My dad, again, was involved in writing a book about him. Yeah, so there's plays, you can see the poetry. If you go online, there's a website on him, and I'll talk about him, more at some point. I'll come back if you like.
Well, he's a great figure, and he was involved in establishing the School for the Blind in Liverpool, which is still going. I think one of the most notable things was after the American Revolution, he wrote to, I think it was Washington, but he wrote to some quite prominent figures in the American Revolution saying, what's all this slavery business? Surely that doesn't sit well with the principles of the American Revolution, but they never replied to his letters. But right. Absolutely phenomenal character. And he very much lived the life and got his hands dirty, and then did well for himself later on and left such a legacy. Yeah. But it'd be great to speak about Edward Ruston again. I gave some money to Nerve, and people can donate to Nerve. And I have a model where I'm looking for people to donate the price of a cup of coffee once a month to my podcast to gain momentum, to keep it going into the future and to expand. And people have got a lot of power to pick and choose what they do. And I don't know if you've listened to the Blind Boy podcast. He's Irish. He's been diagnosed as autistic. He's great on politics, on Irish history, on creativity and all that. He's brilliant. And he always says, support independent podcasts, support independent work as much as possible, because, that makes a big difference, and it goes against this kind of more generalized narrative. And it is hard. And I think the love of it is good at first. And you're like, oh, this is great. But then it's after a few months or a year, and you think, oh, I wish this could get out there a little bit more and just make a bit more of an impact. But in many ways, that's the big test, how much you want it and how much you're willing to persevere with it and learn and develop.
Working class writers, there's not enough working class writers. Yeah. And we do have a writing group as well. And there's plenty of writing groups around, to help people, and book groups and things. Yeah. Where if you do have ideas of it, you can lay it with them, Their ideas of raising funds, it depends on, what it is, whether you can get money from trade unions, which we got money from the trade unions to do that. Harry Constable and the other one, the Edward Ruston. Yeah, it is hard, but you got to keep plugging away.
Yeah, keep fighting the good fight. On that note, Ritchie, I've took a valuable hour of your digging time while you're planting the seeds for the future on your allotment. The importance of history is it informs everything we do in the present. And I think what you do with Nerve, we'll put all the details in the podcast notes for people to check out. And I think that you put a lot of effort into things locally in recent decades. And I just want to say thank you for, first of all, when I first met you about 17 years ago and working with you on different campaigns and working with you at Nerve. It's great to speak to you again. We bumped into each other, didn't we? Was it about a year ago at Moorfield Station? Obviously, me being a father and that, and it's stuff got COVID and all that. People haven't seen each other for a while, but it was great to bounce into you again and great to see what you're doing. But people who are listening, support Ritchie and the Nerve magazine. If you want to contribute to that magazine, there's details on the website as well. But Ritchie, any other closing comments before we finish?
I just like to say, well, to everybody, if this goes out to that, it's a special sort of thing, that we've got these different organisations around, yours included. You all add up to the fabric of our society and our culture, and we need to keep all of these going. There's organisations around that grassroots organisations that will help people, and we need to get together and work with them. Campaigns and whatever. It's the
Yeah.
only way we're going to change society.
Absolutely, amen to that. And I just want to finish. I always quote the famous Israeli writer who wrote A Brief History of Humankind, it's called.
Yeah.
But in his book, Harari, who's an Israeli academic, he's really, really good on, he's a medievalist, but he writes about human nature and he's a futurist as well. But what he says is for people to improve the world, you need to know yourself, better yourself, and join organizations which accord with your principles to change things. And it puts humans at the center of things, but it's how we work together with others that we can truly change things as well, with similar beliefs and interests. But I always remember that when I heard him getting interviewed and through his work, very, very relevant and important stuff. But Ritchie, thanks again for all your time, mate. And
Okay.
we'll